In this class, we're going to focus on developing countries, and mostly we will focus on India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, China, and then we'll come across the Atlantic and focus on Mexico, Brazil, and perhaps a couple more Latin American countries. Then we will move to talk about a few countries in Africa, but not in great detail. Africa is a more involved analysis than I would like to engage in this class. So mainly Latin America and Asia will be the focus. We'll do some comparison and contrast with the industrialized world just to keep things in perspective. But the class starts out at the end of World War II, when the United States won the war, as I like to put it, and asked Europe, which was devastated from the bombings and all the other actions in the World War II, World War I and World War II, to give up their colonies. The European countries had colonized most of the developing world, and America, I like to say, had no colonies, and America was helping to rebuild Europe and Japan, and under the Marshall Plan, the U.S. was going to fund the rebuilding, but also the United Nations was established at the end of World War II, and the important agencies within the United Nations that helped to foster development were the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and what is now known as the World Trade Organization to some degree. Its first incarnation, it was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, also known as the GATT. So how will we start the course? I will start with the decolonization period in the 1940s when Europe was asked to decolonize, and we'll start with the first country under the British influence to become an independent nation, and that will be India. 1947, India was split into India and Pakistan. So we say Hindustan was separated into India and Pakistan. Pakistan was a resettlement of Muslims from within Hindustan to the west and to the east of India, northwest and northeast, I would say. And now those two regions that were once called Pakistan are now known as Pakistan and Bangladesh. There were East and West Pakistan. West Pakistan is now regular Pakistan, and East Pakistan is now Bangladesh as of the 1970s. So that's where we start. Then we move outside of the British realm and we focus on Indonesia for a short moment. And then we come back to Britain and the British decolonization movement on this side of the Atlantic. And we then look at a small country in the Caribbean called Jamaica. So the analysis will focus on a large colony becoming independent, and then we'll move maybe 15 years later to a small country becoming independent. The large country is largely a closed economy, not relying on international trade, and the small economy is one that relied heavily on international trade because the colony was an export enclave for England, and the exports in that time were bananas and a raw material called alumina or bauxite, from which we get aluminum, and then there's also agricultural products such as sugar. So that's where we start the decolonization process on this side of the Atlantic, and in India we start with focusing on how India put development plans in place to advance its development. So that's the beginning of the course, the first two sessions, and we'll focus on India's decolonization and then Jamaica's decolonization. So if you take a look at session 1, you will see the focus is on India, and there's a lot of video content that I would like for you to take a look at. In that session, we'll try to explain what economic development is, and the Indian development model in the 1940s would be a good place, as I said, to start. The textbook has cases at the end of each chapter. The case that they offer is Brazil. I will tell you when you need to focus on those cases. For the most part, you stick to the outline I've offered. So as we focus on India's decolonization, we will look at a few important video vignettes. One of them was done by Daniel Yergin, who wrote Commanding Heights, which became a video series, 6 hours of riveting content. And I would really like for you to spend a lot of time thinking about the opening vignettes, which talk about how India decolonized. The first video case I will give you will relate to a rural problem. You can call it an environmental/agricultural/rural problem. It focuses on a village called Sukomadri, and the village had a problem with land slippage, soil erosion. The government offered a solution, and the situation improved, but then it got worse, and I want you to analyze how that was handled and what lessons we can learn from that video segment. I can see that the material is a little dated. It has been quite a while I've been using this material, but the lessons in a historical context are important lessons, and I really appreciate you spending the time thinking through the development process in a historical context. So as I said, we're going to start with World War II and work our way up maybe to the 20th century. After I focus on that Indian village called Sukomadri, I'll then focus on a comparison and contrast between rural India and urban India, because urban India is developing very fast, but rural India is not really developing that fast. What we will then see occurring is that people who want opportunities leave the rural area and head towards the urban area, and by the end of the semester we'll talk about the urban unemployment problems that India has. After we get done with comparing and contrasting India and Jamaica, we're going to switch focus to China. India and China are the countries in the world with the two largest populations. I'd say certainly 40% of the world's population lives in these two countries. We'll talk more about the population levels and the population dynamics over the semester. But as we move the comparison from India, Jamaica to India, China, we're going to focus on two countries that are trying to develop, one using a democratic approach and the other using a communist approach. Under the communist system, the government has full control, and that obviously changes how things work compared to a democracy. Now, even though India is called the largest democracy in the world, I would say that there are times that India does not act like a democracy. So even though we are making that political/governmental comparison, we will see that there are times that the Indian government acted more in a socialist manner and actually was acting more like China in terms of planning the economic development. So clearly, a large portion of our class is going to talk about the lives of poor people. We will spend some time defining poverty and looking at poverty in a more global context. We'll ask questions about how individuals rise out of poverty and what the challenges are, not only at the individual level but also at the national level. As you plan your economy's development, how can you plan to pull the nation out of poverty? What are the routes to economic growth and prosperity? You may be familiar with Adam Smith's inquiry into the wealth of nations, where he asked that question. Wealth of Nations is considered the first classic that helped to define the field of economics in 1776 when it was published. So we've had 200 plus years of theorizing about how to grow economies and get them out of poverty. When we talk about Jamaica, we'll talk about a trade-related model of economic growth, and when we talk about India and China, we'll talk about a development that is more internally driven. One of the things we'll say about most of these developing countries is that they have an abundance of labor and a shortage of physical capital. Capital is a nebulous concept in economics. It is generally everything that's not labor at some level and not land. So we talk about three main resources: land, labor, and capital. And anything that embodies labor to help us in the future to save labor will be considered capital. So a computer might be considered capital, a tractor might be considered capital, a car might be considered capital. The camera I'm using is considered capital. So there are many forms of capital, physical capital, things that help us to advance the production process. And we combine labor with these capital units to produce even more. So one of the first models we will focus on is a model of economic development that focuses on how to accumulate more capital so that the economy can grow itself out of poverty. That one sector model is often referred to as the Harrod-Domar model because of the two economists who developed it, Harrod and Domar. After that, when we talk about rural-urban scenarios, we will introduce a second important model called the Lewis model of economic development, or the structural change model of economic development. This model will talk about transferring resources from rural areas to urban areas to watch how that helps the economic development process. The germ of the idea, according to Lewis, is that workers in the rural area do not operate in the same way that workers in an urban area operate. The urban area has what we call capitalists, individuals who are organizing the labor in a way that they can make a profit as they produce whatever they are producing for the economy. The thinking in the rural area is more traditional, and the principle of marginalism or marginal economics is not assumed to apply. So for example, if you have more workers available, they will go to work in the fields and produce more agricultural output. The downside is that sometimes the marginal contribution of the last worker is very low, in which case if the worker could be transferred to the urban area where his or her marginal productivity would be higher, then society would be better off with that individual relocating to the urban area to assist the economy's economic growth and development. So there we have it, an introduction to the course where we start by focusing on a few countries. Then we ask questions about the resources that are available in these countries and how we can combine these resources in various ways to advance what we call economic growth. Now, mind you, we have to come up with a definition of economic development. And economic development is more than economic growth. Yes, growth is important, but the way I will define economic development and the way many textbook authors have defined it, it is more than growth. It is growth plus the structural change in the economy that causes us to move away from traditional low productivity activities into modern high productivity activities, so that individuals are transferring themselves out of low wage and low skilled activities into higher wage and high skilled activities. So that economic transformation, changing the economy from a rural based agricultural or mining or primary products related economic driver to a modern economic driver. There are many questions as to whether when you put these resources in the manufacturing sector, if it will definitely bring about economic development. So that's a question we will also look at. So a definition of economic development is very important, and we say it's more than growth. I say the definition we will most likely use is growth plus structural change, but growth that reduces the income inequality in society, starting with the idea that the incomes are skewed towards a few rich individuals who make the policies and control for whatever historical reasons. We'll have a situation where more and more people are moving out of poverty into higher income earning categories, and that's supposedly a good thing for the society. So again, we start with India. We look at India's rural problems. We make a comparison, contrast between rural India and urban India. Then we talk about Jamaica the next session, and Jamaica is a small island, so we might just say it's urban. Regardless, it is so hard to define it as either rural or urban, but we'll discuss Jamaica in a trade-related context. So we bring in the trade variables, the exporting and the importing aspects in that particular country. Then I said we go back to China, and we do the India-China comparison contrast to see how the political systems affect the economic development. Mind you, I should say that China is growing faster than India, and that could be understood because China is managing its development whereas India is allowing the market forces, I think, to determine how resources get allocated or misallocated. As we discuss trade and Jamaica, we will spend a lot of time discussing the banana situation. And the banana case will come up. It's a very important historical case. And if I can give you a quick snippet into where that is going, my version of the story is that American fruit companies moved their production to Latin American countries, bought large tracts of land in Central America and South American countries, and planted various types of fruit. We'll start with United Fruit, aka Chiquita, producing bananas in Central America and seeing the Europeans buying Caribbean bananas at a premium price, but not buying the Latin American bananas at the same price. So the historical explanation for why Europe is buying these bananas from the Caribbean at a higher price will need to be brought in. Very quickly, after the end of World War II, when decolonization was taking place, Britain did not have anything to give to its ex-colonies as they were setting them free, allowing them to pursue political independence. So what Britain did was allow these countries to continue to export whatever they were exporting after they became independent. So in the case of Jamaica, for example, let's stay with bananas for a while. Jamaica was exporting bananas to England, partly because England had set up this trading arrangement when Jamaica was still a colony. How do we fast forward after political independence? Because, as I said, Britain had nothing to give in terms of a golden handshake. Britain offered to continue to buy Jamaican bananas and Caribbean bananas at a premium price. But the Central American producers, really American producers in Central America, objected to this and brought a case before the World Trade Organization to ask Britain, Europe, to cease and desist in terms of its preferential treatment of the Caribbean. So that is the beginning of the end of agriculture in the Caribbean, because the preferential trading arrangements that these countries had with Europe were now being dismantled thanks to the World Trade Organization. So there you have it, the opening of the course, 3 countries and the topic of poverty. So that'll take us to the first midterm exam, 3 countries plus poverty. A lot of other topics will come up as well, but if you take a look at the first exam study guide, you'll get a sense as to what you need to know as you prepare for that first exam. So that's it for now, and I hope that we have a happy time with this course, that we can make good progress and learn a lot. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions.